Welcome, everyone. I think we're kind of on now. I'd like to welcome you all to the Heidelberg Center for American Studies. My name is Wilfried Mausbach, and I'm the Executive Director here at the HCA. This is the second event in an online series on American politics and culture in historical context that explores current events against the backdrop of American history. The bigger picture, as we labeled it, brings together experts in American history and culture to help shed light on current events and developments. It is jointly organized by the German Historical Institute in Washington and the Heidelberg Center for American Studies. Before I introduce tonight's discussants, I'd like to bring my good friend and colleague Axel Jansen from DC to say a few words on behalf of the German Historical Institute. Axel.
Thanks, Willy. So yes, as Willy said, my name is Axel Jansen. I'm the Deputy Director of the German Historical Institute, Washington, and it is my great pleasure also from this end to welcome you both in the atrium at the Heidelberg Center for American Studies and online via Zoom. I want to use this opportunity to thank everyone involved in today's event, the panelists, Manfred, Michelle, our wonderful partners at the HCA, at the German Association for American Studies, and of course, my dear colleagues here at the GHI in DC. If you would like to know more about the work of the GHI, our fellowships, our publications, and our public events online in DC and at Berkeley, you'll find a ton of information on our website, and I'll post the link to the chat in a moment. So I will now recede into the background, but I'll be there to handle questions that you, the online audience, may have for the panelists. So please write your questions into the Q&A. And if you would like to remain anonymous, simply don't include your name. You may have noticed, of course, that this event is being recorded. So with this, thanks everyone. Willy, back to you.
Thanks, Axel. Near the end of the last century, the renowned historian Alan Brinkley called conservatism the orphan within American historical scholarship, something isolated and abandoned, not part of the system, a lone line at the bottom of the page, so to speak. That has certainly changed since the 1990s, but there still seems to be an urgent need to explain what American conservatism is, and perhaps an even more pressing necessity to clarify why it ended up where it is today. In order to do this, we have luckily been able to recruit two distinguished experts for this second installment of the bigger picture. Michelle Nickerson is a historian and author who teaches at Loyola University, Chicago. Her first book, Mothers of Conservatism, Women and the Post-War Right, published by Princeton University Press in 2012, tells the story of 1950s Southern Californian housewives who shaped the grassroots right in the 2 decades following World War II. For her most recent monograph, she moved from conservatives in California to the Catholic left. Spiritual Criminals, How the Camden 28 Put the Vietnam War on Trial, will appear next month, I think, with the University of Chicago Press. Michelle has been a Fulbright Scholar at the HCA 3 years ago, and we are enthused to have you back in Heidelberg, Michelle, to help us live the bigger picture of American conservatism. Manfred Berg hardly needs an introduction, certainly not in Heidelberg, and most likely neither among experts on US history anywhere else. But since these two criteria still exclude a few person peopling this planet, and perhaps joining us thanks to the blessings of modern technology, let me quickly mention at least that he holds the Kurt Engelhorn Chair in American History at Heidelberg University, and that his latest monograph has hit the shelves barely a month ago. Published in German with Klett Cotta, the book is titled Das gespaltene Haus, A House Divided, and it traces the history of polarization in the US since the 1950s. Manfred, since we have an audience in both Germany and the United States, and perhaps beyond, would you care to start by briefly outlining some differences and commonalities, maybe also of US and European, specifically German conservatism in the post-war period?
Thank you, Wilfried. Thank you, Michelle. And thanks everyone for coming. It's a great honor to be included. I'd like to emphasize 4 major differences. First, US conservatism lacks a Christian democratic tradition that combines cultural traditionalism with social responsibility and support for the welfare state. I would just remind everybody that it were the leaders of the Christian democratic parties, people such as Adenauer and De Gasperi in Italy, who were instrumental in building the welfare state after the Second World War. Second, I think in post-war Europe, we do not find an equivalent for what in the United States is or was known as the race question. Post-war European society, Western European societies considered themselves as ethnically homogeneous. And I would argue that the race issues were among the key drivers of radicalization among US conservatives. Third, and I'd really like to hear Michelle's take on that, I don't think there is something like an equivalent for the religious right in Western Europe. Both the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches at large were close to the state, while secularization undermined their social and political clout. And I think we do not really see a religious backlash against the cultural upheavals of the 1960s, what is known as the value change, Wertewandel, to the extent that we see as a mobilizing force in the United States. And finally, I would argue that although European and American conservatives shared the anti-communism of the Cold War era, there was no real equivalent in Western Europe of the anti-communist hysteria of the McCarthy era. And I would say this was partly due to the fact that, less so in Germany, but certainly in France and Italy, communists were, for several decades, still a viable force in in European politics. Obviously, that was not the case in the US. So these were just 4 ideas that I would throw out, and maybe there are questions or comments on that.
All right, thank you, Manfred. So Michelle, how did Americans come to think of themselves as conservative in the first place?
Well, first I want to start by saying how wonderful it is to be back in Heidelberg, and to thank you for the invitation, and say how pleased I am to share the stage with both of you. So in response to your question and to Professor Berg's comments, I agree with these distinctions between European and American conservatism, and it gets to this way in which I want to explain how conservatism in the United States emerged very much as a movement in ways that it didn't here. So to begin with that, let me give you a quote here. So I don't know how many of you saw it a couple weeks ago. The journalist David Brooks for the New York Times published a transcript of an interview he had just conducted with Stephen Bannon. So Bannon, who was the one-time advisor to Donald Trump and leading voice of the American right, described the listeners of his popular podcast, War Room, as activists. He deliberately uses that word, activists, undertaking a, quote, populist revolt. Now, this is important here, and I'm underscoring it because what we see happening is that this movement of conservatism that started after World War II, a movement that deliberately invokes that word conservatism to describe a set of principles, to take a moral position, to incorporate Christianity, that is now giving way to something different. So another important element of conservatism from the beginning was populism. The first people in the US to embrace that word conservatism or conservative as a political identity were intellectuals associated with the popular periodical, The National Review. And then when Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona, published his popular best-selling book, The Conscience of a Conservative, then the word spread and Americans began to adopt it as their identity, and it became the identity of the Republican Party, represented most popularly, let's say, by Ronald Reagan. But the populism was always there. And that, in a sense, the conservative movement embraced the ultranationalism and the anti-communism, the Red Scare that Professor Berg mentioned, to always be part of their movement, even if they didn't much care for the conspiracy theories that came along with it. The other part of it was the conservative movement made a great deal of room for what was described then, and you still hear now, as states' rights. This was the clarion call of Southern Republicans who were opposed to desegregation. These were Southerners who wanted to hold on to the racial order of Jim Crow, and the Republican Party and conservatism made room for these racial ideas. You would call it white supremacy, because it was anti-statist, it was anti-federal government, and it favored state power. And then this comes around full circle to 4 months ago. So the presidency is now, we have our leading candidates, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And in an interview, Donald Trump says, and this is in March, he says, quote, "I'm not a conservative." Quote, "People say you're conservative. I'm not conservative. You know what I am. I'm a man of common sense. And a lot of conservative policies are common sense." And so this is what we're seeing is this pivot where politicians on the right are letting go of that word conservative to understand who they are. And so I will leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Conservatives starting to think of themselves as those with kind of common sense. Manfred, in your kind of book, you look at these developments since the recent book, you look at these developments since the 1950s. What were, in your view, the most important developments on the conservative side since the 1950s?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I agree with what Michelle just said about the populist turn, as Michael Kazin, of conservatism, as Michael Kazin has called it, and also the conservative turn of populism. And I think this movement, I mean, historians will generally argue it's a fusion of various ideological strands, basically an odd marriage between libertarians and social conservatives under the umbrella of anti-communism. That's what we call fusionism, and what Buckley and the National Review were promoting. But in terms of issues, I would think that what the success of the conservative movement was really predicated on the fusion of racial resentment among those who believed that they were the losers of Black advancement and the civil rights revolution. Secondly, the resurgence of religion, of social code, whether you want to call it a backlash against the liberalization and pluralization of lifestyles that was wrought by the cultural revolution of the so-called radical 60s. And finally, the anti-government impetus, anti-tax impetus that resounded, I would say, particularly loud in the 1970s when the boom had ended and America's, not only America's, but American working and middle classes became hard-pressed by inflation and rising property taxes, for example.
Okay. Michelle, you have also looked in particular at women in the conservative movement. So let me put it kind of this way. How did we get from Californian housewife populism and suburban warriors to Marjorie Taylor Greene?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, housewife populism, in contrast to conservatism, which is the word that people use to describe themselves, housewife populism is not something that anyone called themselves. This is a concept that I developed to try and help us understand an ideological formation of the mid-20th century, meaning this is how women and men understood the political importance of women in a very conservative way. So it's another way also of describing the formation and change of political consciousness of women. So on the right, women, for example, in the 50s, 60s, when I dug into this, it was clear that they were voting and joining the same organizations of conservative men, but they saw themselves and they put themselves forward in a very different way. They would speak, they would be the spokespeople on behalf of families, children, their local schools, their churches, their communities. It's how they imagine themselves in the emerging religious right. And they saw it as their primary purpose to be the protectors of the basic institutions of American life, what I just mentioned. They also saw themselves as being better prepared to fight communism because they themselves had the flexible schedules and what they saw as the instinct to find communism where it lurked, to be able to do the deep digging in order to find the dangers in their school systems, et cetera. And lastly, the reason I call it housewife populism is what was new in the 1940s, 1950s, is that they increasingly came to describe themselves as ordinary housewives, meaning they saw themselves as being representative of the people in their views and in their lifestyles, meaning no matter what their wealth was, their education level, or the class status that they inhabited, to be ordinary was to be anti-elitist, to be fighting for your community against the federal government and against academic elites. Now you can see where Marjorie Taylor Greene both reflects and departs from this formation. Unlike the conservative women of say 10 to 20 years ago, and I'm thinking actually of women like Sarah Palin or Michelle Bachmann, she does not promote her own politics or her policy positions as a mom, though she herself has 3 children. Plenty of women do so, by the way, like the Moms for Liberty, but Green has succeeded in keeping the spotlight mainly on herself and away from her family. And for example, she was divorced a couple of years ago, and it really did not attract a whole lot of attention. When it comes to voting, she votes like Matthew Gates and Josh Hawley. But if we're being honest here, she draws power from being an outrageous woman who snubs decorum, who burnishes her image as a tough, trash-talking Southern gal. And she squarely fits into the mold of MAGA, Make America Great Again populism. She is, I would describe her as the mean girl complement to a gangster Trump. You can hear her supporters and his supporters saying, yeah, she's kind of a bully. There are bullies. There are bullies for the right and the greatness of our nation.
All right, yeah, I think that's a great characterization of her, as great as you can kind of come up with. Manfred, in addition to the role of politicians such as Barry Goldwater or Richard Nixon, what institutional developments help explain the transformation of American conservatism? For example, what role have organizations such as the Heritage Foundation played in moving the Republican Party to the right? And what has been the role of media? I think that is, of course, something that we would need probably to talk about in the changes also in the media environment since, let's say, the 1970s.
I think when the famous historians of the liberal consensus disparaged conservatives as an intellectually not really respectable movement in the 1950s, they vastly underestimated the innovative force behind that movement that Michelle just described. I would argue that in many respects, and some of the conservative spokespersons have admitted to that, they learned from the left, they emulated techniques from the left, such as grassroots organizing. They were pioneers in direct mailing, in fundraising, in building networks. The think tanks obviously are an important innovation. In many ways, I would say they help to lend respectability to conservatism as an intellectual movement. They provided shelter for many intellectuals who would no longer feel at home at American universities for reasons that I'm inclined to understand. Obviously, these organizational structures played an important role in leadership recruitment. Just think of the Federalist Society and their long and sustained effort to build up a pool of potential Supreme Court justices and federal judges. So, and you can add, of course, the fundraising successes with billionaires such as Joseph Coors and later the Koch brothers. So I would say I'm apparently not exactly sympathizer of the conservative movement in the United States, but one has to recognize that their success did not fall from the skies. It was the result of a sustained and impressive organizational effort.
Certainly so. Michelle, your new book takes a closer look at religion in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and in particular at the Catholic left. Religion is understood to play a major role in today's conservative politics, as we already kind of heard, although mostly via evangelical Protestants, right? That's what we think about it. Still, the conservative Supreme Court majority is mostly Catholic, including not only Chief Justice John Roberts, but also Clarence Thomas, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, of course, and Neil Gorsuch at least has been raised Catholic, even though he now attends Episcopal Church. So how much has conservatism been, and how much is it today shaped by religion, in your view?
Well, it's a good question, and I'll start by repeating something that you just said. It's not so much about religion as it is about Christianity, or to be even more specific, white evangelicalism has dominated the conservative movement since it became a movement in the 1960s. And this is mainly because, first of all, of their overwhelming numbers, also because of the success of evangelical church leaders in forming close relationships with people in power, of course, mostly Republican politicians at the highest level of government. And because the white evangelical movement, since it's split from Black evangelicals very early in American history over the issue of slavery, and then into the Jim Crow period, the split over segregation, it has been by nature suspicious of reform, of inclusion, of government intervention, etc. Nevertheless, as you pointed out, Catholics have always been part of this coalition, this conservatism. And that's mainly been, I would say, since the 1950s. By then, Catholics in the United States were less an immigrant church than an established part of American society that made up about 1/4 of the population. Catholic influence in American politics grew starting at that point, especially as the church itself grew even more outspoken against communism, particularly its atheist internationalism. Its influence grew even stronger in the 70s and 80s as Catholics first took the lead on the abortion issue. They launched the first organizations and attacks against abortion policy. Evangelicals eventually took over, but Catholics were at the forefront, and they have always been part of which I'm sure everyone here knows to be the most successful single issue campaign in American history, abortion. So what has interested me as a historian of what was called in the 60s and 70s the Catholic left is what happened to Catholics on the left. And at risk of going too deep, I don't want to go into the details of what that was about, but I will just say that my observation is that progressive Catholics, you know, I can't think of a better word to describe this other type of Catholicism, essentially ceded unintentionally, but also willingly, the political thunder of their own church to the political right. Even though there are still plenty of Catholics in the Democratic Party, people like myself, these Catholics on the left have grown far less comfortable than conservatives in wearing religion on their sleeve. Catholics on the right have thus stolen you might say, the institutional power of the Catholic Church. There is a comfortable relationship between Catholics on the right who embrace orthodoxy, rules, covenants, and hierarchies, as well as traditional gender and family roles, what they refer to as complementarity. Whereas we on the left are more inclined to work in secular environments, to embrace interfaith collaboration, and to not refer really generally to our religion when we are in political situations.
Right. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we've been at it now for about half an hour, and I suggest that we open it up to the audiences, so to speak. Those of you who are joining us on the Zoom call will have the opportunity to write questions kind of into the system. And those of you here in our atrium in Heidelberg can, of course, follow the normal line. There are some mics up here, which we're happy to kind of send around kind of for your question. So maybe we can start with the audience here who would like to start with a question. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for such a well-structured analysis. I learned a lot, and I'm interested in the housewife populism that you described so vividly. I guess it doesn't get a place in the history of feminism in the US, or does it? And in what way? And what has become of these conservative women in the meantime? You spoke about them, and that seems to be far away from our understanding today.
Yeah.
What is the women's role today, or in the last decades in the conservative movement? How has that developed over time? Has it disappeared? That would be one question. And the other question is, speaking as an economist, to me it always seemed that Reaganomics and the conservative ideas of the Reagan administration in the sphere of economics was really a triumph of conservatism. Was successful in a sense that it also influenced other countries around the world. What happened in Great Britain and the US in the 1980s became, to a certain degree, a role model for many Western democracies in terms of a neoliberal turn. So would you say that this was a triumph of conservatism, the aids and the economic policy agenda of the Reagan administration? Was it at the center of the success?
I'll start to answer that, but I think Manfred has some answers to that too. So that was a great question about feminism. And one of the things that I found is that when women were developing this sense of their political importance and calling themselves ordinary housewives, there were equivalents on the left, and other historians have written about that. There were, historians have called this communalism among women who were organizing to save their families during the Great Depression, with meat strikes and boycotts, etc. There was an anti-elitist element of family protection involved with that. And there is what we call maternalism, right, which is a more progressive way of understanding the role of middle-class women to support families. So they weren't alone in that respect. And it's not so much the conservative women as a force, an activist force has disappeared so much as this ideology has changed with the times, I guess is the way I would put it. Especially since now that if you are a woman and you are in right-wing politics, frankly, you have more choices for who you want to be and how you want to influence politics. There was not a place for the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world in the 1950s and in the 1960s. And Reaganomics, yes, we probably haven't talked enough about that. But I think to answer your question, I would say, yes, Reaganomics can be acknowledged as a victory for the conservative movement, especially because it was ultimately then adopted by the Democrats, by the Clinton-era Democratic Party that continued to advance the tax cuts and the new policies that had been introduced by Reagan and his Congress.
Well, I would actually not be so sure whether Reaganomics and the Reagan era should be called a triumph of conservatism, because what you really see is economically it's the triumph of neoliberalism, but as historians such as Gary Gerstle and others have recently argued, neoliberalism had at least for the final 2 decades of the 20th century, had a mass base, and not only among social conservatives and libertarians, but also among many of the socially upwardly mobile people who, in a way, it was, as Mark Liller and others have said, it was the fusion of 2 revolutions: the Reagan revolution in the area of neoliberalism, and the promise of individual liberty and self-actualization that emanated from the 1960s. I can't really see, and many, particularly among the social conservatives, were disappointed with Reagan. Reagan and his successor paid lip service to their values, but I wonder if the 1980s or the 1990s, they were not an era of socially conservative backlash. The liberalization and pluralization of lifestyles based on individual choice was going on. That would be my argument.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'd like to bring someone in from the online audience, an anonymous participant here. Says, dear panelists, could you please address regional and geographic dimensions of conservatism in the US? We associate the religious right with the South, the Mountain West, Southern California in the early days. But in later times, has MAGA conservatism signified a more national focus and fewer regional specifics?
That's a good question, and it's a good point. I would say that all of those regions that were identified by the viewer were part of the conservative. There were different ways in which conservatives understood themselves in those regions, and their own values and their own history coming out of the particular politics of space. In the South, it was understood very much in terms of desegregation and massive resistance and civil rights. And that was important to people in other parts of the country as well. But the residents of the Sun Belt had a different understanding of their own modernity and relationship to race. Also in the Mountain West, it tended to be more multiplicity of racial identities. And I think that perhaps because of the media environment that we talked about earlier, it could very much be the case that the MAGA movement tends to be more national in terms of, or let's just say less regional in terms of its own forms of expression, is how I would put it.
Right. That makes sense, I would say. I think I'd like to return it to the audience here in Heidelberg. Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for this fascinating panel. Well, maybe first, as an addition to the first question, I think we could conceptualize online drag wives as some sort of continuation of the housewife populism nowadays. But I had a question about the Catholic left. You talked about how the Catholic left publicly does not foreground religion and Catholicism, but in their self-understanding, how do they root their activism in Catholicism? What are their positive narratives why they do want to root it in Catholicism? And then as a second question, at the risk of turning the happened to happening, I wonder if you feel comfortable to be talking about Project 2025 and what the continuities and discontinuities of that embodies for the American conservative movement.
Thanks. I've been told that I should kind of repeat the question for our online audience because they might not be able to hear it as well. I'm, of course, trying to be kind of more brief. So the question, I think, and that probably goes to Michelle, is how did kind of conservatives root their activism in Catholicism to a certain extent, and then
Catholic left.
The Catholic left, that is. And then the second question was about the project, so-called Project 2025, by a think tank, and we already have talked about think tank and what it means for the Trump administration. So a possible future Trump administration, I should say. Michelle.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for that question from my former student here, Lila, in the room. It's such a pleasure to see you there. And thanks for the question about the Catholic left. I guess I'm going to have to switch gears here. So the Catholic left, they were called this by journalists. They basically named them that in the late 1960s. And it comes out of opposition to the Vietnam War. Their political ideals and actions really come out of what they call the Catholic worker tradition of the Great Depression era. And it's rooted in Catholic social teaching, drawn from church documents dating back centuries, that grounds Catholicism in its in anti-poverty measures, in peace, in support of the rights of labor, of working class people to form unions, and in economic policies that are meant to create the circumstances for people to achieve economic security. And these politics galvanized activists against the war, who actually raided draft boards and stole thousands, tens of thousands of draft files. And I'm glad you asked also, it's because it still exists today. In fact, there is a movement that is the inheritor of the Vietnam era Catholic left called plowshares. And they still do these raids, but of like nuclear facilities, and nobody pays any attention anymore. The last thing I want to say, because it does relate to conservatism, is it's often very hard to put these Catholic radicals on the political spectrum of the current moment, because many of them see themselves as outside parties. Some of them won't even vote. And a lot of their ideals some of them are very traditional in their attitudes about family. Some of them live like trad wives. And so it's hard to put them in the Democratic coalition the way we might have at one point.
Okay, Manfred, do you want to take?
Yeah, I think in many ways, this so-called Project 2025 has deep roots in American constitutional thought. I just look back at Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Papers on the presidency, and of course, Hamilton argued for a strong, possibly lifelong presidency. We have long periods in American history when the presidents were weak and hardly mattered in American politics, particularly after the Civil War. But of course, in recent decades, the US president, or throughout the 20th century, has become the mythical, most powerful man in the world. And we've always had advisors to the presidents and intellectuals arguing for what under the George W. Bush administration was known as the unified executive. What we're seeing right now is that on the one hand, you have these intellectuals who craft ideas about strengthening the office and authority of the president even more and shielding it from control by the other two powers. And I would argue that the recent ruling by the US Supreme Court, although I do not see it as entirely illegitimate as some commentators have argued, but in essence, I'm afraid it will deliver something like a carte blanche, and of course, Trump was hysterical about it and interpreted it exactly the way that he wishes the presidency, namely an elected dictatorship.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to go back to our online audience for a moment to a question from Tim. And Tim is interested to hear you, Michelle, talk a little more about the growth and influence of so-called evangelical Catholics and their influence on conservatism. So the growth of First Things and its sphere of intellectual and political influence. Richard Neuhaus, Steele Hudson are mentioned here in the question, and the culture wars issues that have helped the new evangelical Catholics grow in building also a bridge back to Protestants who traditionally harbored a greater deal of hostility towards Catholics. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on factors also beyond abortion. I mean, you already, of course, foregrounded abortion, but maybe you can say a little bit more what brought this coalition together.
So it's interesting, that word evangelical Catholics. I think in many instances, it is appropriate. There are members of the church who belong to communities who are engaged in a much more deliberate way of spreading the word and bringing people into the church. One of the reasons for this development is that, as you probably know, the United States, like Europe, has been secularizing. The Catholic Church has shrunk considerably in the past 10 and 20 years, but it's not a uniform retrenchment, meaning most of the people who are either leaving or people who are leaving orders, people who are not staying in the faith, they tend to be on the left, they tend to be progressive. Most of the people coming up through the clergy and joining the church and staying in the church tend to be conservative. It's getting harder and harder for churches to replace pastors with clergy who are not overtly traditionalist or orthodox or conservative in some way. And so that has been a big part of it. But I think I'm going to stop there in the interest of time.
All right, thanks. Do we, have another question from the audience here in Heidelberg?
Hello, Professor Mausbach, Professor Berg. As students, as Chinese students studying American Studies, Master of American Studies, I want to ask a question that's related to the foreign policies of Republicans, especially for the conservatism people, the politicians. That is, according to what I know, for most of Republican presidents, from Richard Nixon, Reagan, and Bush the Junior and Bush the Senior, usually they tend to show a kind of attitudes, friend attitudes to China that cooperates with China. but at the same time try to repress the strong power from Russia, from the Soviet Union. But just like your presentation, that's from Trump's era has changed. Trumpism changed this traditional idea, and that is in his tenure, he started with a trade war with China, and also he said that he will protect Taiwan if Taiwan in some conflict with China. I have already talked this issue with my friends, sometimes some from China, Taiwan. What I care about is that if Trump would be the president, I mean, he wins a presidential election in 2024. What's the new conservatism will influence his foreign policies, especially for the China issue to some extent?
Okay, yeah. So I'm trying to again kind of give the gift of that question to our online audience. It's basically a foreign policy centered question on foreign policies towards China and kind of also Taiwan. And if Trump would be returning to the presidency, how that would impact these kind of policies. Do you want to take that, Manfred?
Well, the one thing that I'd like to say in response to that question is that the position toward China is one of the few issues in American policy on which there is still a relatively solid bipartisan consensus. This is not, in terms of what we've been talking about, is not really a development that I find is pertinent to the developments of conservatism. What I find extremely important and, of course, interesting is that the Republican Party, which once was the party of Ronald Reagan, who famously declared the Soviet Union the evil empire, that party now is partly enthralled by Vladimir Putin, sees him as an ideological ally in the fight against wokeism. The Republican Party, which at least in the post-war era shared in the elite consensus of what we might call globalism and internationalism, at least under Trump, has returned to a visceral America first nationalism. I hesitate to call it isolationism for a number of reasons, but China would be, excuse me, the odd man out. I think if the Chinese leadership decided to use force annexing Taiwan, even a Trump administration would respond militarily.
The one thing I would add to that would be different, I feel like, under a Trump administration versus a Democratic administration would be the way in which Republicans would target Chinese nationals and Chinese Americans and other Asians in the United States for the perceived threats to American democracy and culture. We saw this during the last Trump administration, during COVID, and the insistence on calling COVID the Wuhan flu and making the problem of China about Chinese and Asian people in the United States, this belief in a subversive Asian threat.
Okay. I'm going to, again, return to the online audience for kind of a question. This is again by an anonymous kind of participant who asks, could you talk about Black conservatives? not just well-known names like Clarence Thomas or Sowell, but grassroots efforts to organize socially conservative Black people, for instance, in the anti-abortion movement also.
I'm not really conversant in that, or not, can't really claim much expertise, but what comes to my mind is that in the initial movement against abortion, a Black physician named Mildred Jefferson played a key role. It's also, I think, important to see that we have in recent years observed a certain shift of the Black vote toward the Republican Party. I'm not so sure, though, to what they're actually responding, whether they have actually become social conservatives, or whether it's more like the bread and butter issues that Trump frames in a way that appeals to ordinary Americans in terms of economic and political nationalism.
I really see this as no joke, and I think it's a problem for the Democratic Party, the ways in which the changing right, moving away, let's say, from conservatism towards the populist Make America Great Again movement, is using a lot of the discontents of working class Americans, middle class Americans, and kind of stealing the agenda in a way to attract non-white voters, that being not just African Americans, but Latino Americans as well. And I think the best explanation for this that I've seen so far is by the writer Naomi Klein in her recent book, Doppelganger, where she talks about, she calls it diagonalism, the ways in which there is a growing contingent of Americans. It is a diverse group. It's not just white, and it's not just rich people who are, they were dissatisfied with the vaccine mandates. They see themselves as opposed to federal power. They see themselves as not being part of any party whatsoever, but really they are part of the far right in their posturing. Here you would call it Querdenken, right? Querdenken, or in the US, MAGA, has a broader constituency than the conservative movement did, for better or for worse.
I also think that there is something to the argument which has been made by African-American dissidents, that there was a certain arrogance to the idea that the Black vote, or the Latino vote for that matter, would be naturally wedded to the Democratic Party. The argument that Teixeira and Judith are now making, who once predicted that the Obama coalition would have long-lasting successes, that these defecting Black and Hispanic voters are put off by the embrace of wokeness and identity politics on the part of the Democratic Party, no less than the white working class.
Right. Yeah. Martin.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I have two questions, comments for both speakers. Even though this is about conservatism, I want to dig again into the American Catholic left. Ask you, Michelle, whether you would see Biden or the candidates as part of the Catholic left, in the sense that this is the connection to conservatism. I think the way I get to know the candidates was that they're very traditional conservative on many religious issues, not in lifestyle, in dogma. For instance, two siblings of, and also whether you would include Robert F. Kennedy, preferred candidate for president into that Catholic left. Two of his siblings, I think, they wanted to have their marriages annulled, not divorced, after 20 years of marriage and children. And they were actually successful in the States. I think whoever archdiocese did, they won't annul the marriage after 20 years, which would not be possible, I think, in Catholic Europe to get that. So they have an appeal, I think, to working class Catholics. But on the other hand, I agree with you, they're completely driven by Catholic social doctrine. When you at Kennedy's autobiography, to compass, it's not about Marxism, it's not about social democracy, it's only about Catholic social, as we said, the working class unions, anti-poverty, education, etc., etc. So, and Biden, I think, he would also see himself probably as Catholic left. And for Manfred already alluded to it, with the foreign policy question, isn't when the question what ever happened to American conservatism lately, isn't it that nationalism and isolationism that we probably underestimated for a long time has come to the fore again. Above all, I think Trump is an American nationalist with populist means and strategies and so on, but it's this America first, we don't care about anything else. They break with the globalism of Reagan, that's the worst you can be also in balance. As a globalist, that's even worse than a communist. He himself thinks of himself as a Leninist. So have we overlooked the strength of this nationalism, isolationism, or was it really so weak for many decades as most of the mainstream writing said it wasn't so fairly recent?
Okay.
So
yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Maybe just to quickly bring that in here again, and I reduce it to this nice idea that Martin asked whether you see Biden or Kennedy as on the Catholic left, you know, or working class Catholic left.
Well, that is a fantastic question because I would say neither one of them is in the sense that Kennedy and Biden they are both centrists. Biden, if I remember his history correctly, was not comfortable with radicalism of the 1960s and 1970s. So he would not be part of that movement, let's say, of activism. Kennedy himself was a hawk, right? He championed an aggressive anti-communist foreign policy. Okay, but then Robert Kennedy. Okay, so elder Robert or younger Robert Kennedy?
Oh.
Okay, I would not consider either of the, I doubt they would consider them part of the Catholic left or vice versa, that the left would embrace them. I would call them liberals, is probably the best way to describe. I would put Nancy Pelosi in the same category of Catholics who embrace a liberal tradition and are very comfortable in Democratic Party politics. The Catholic left tends to describe an activist movement and trend and development coming out of the 60s. So.
Okay, and the other question was about nationalism and isolationism and whether it has been underestimated within this kind of the MAGA movement.
I think the point is very well taken. In the age of American global power during the Cold War and beyond, we tended to believe that this internationalist outlook of American foreign policy was something natural, was a given, but obviously that was not true. I worked a little bit on Woodrow Wilson and his failure to get the League of Nations Covenant ratified. Although one has to say that many of his critics were actually they were isolationists, people like Bora and Hiram Johnson, but at the same time, they were also social progressives at the time. But the Republican Party for a long, long time was uncomfortable. And you had during the 1930s, and particularly in the debate over interventionism before Pearl Harbor, the isolationist wing was particularly strong. So from a historical perspective, I think, and also I think it ties in with your work, opposition against the United Nations was a major mobilizing issue among these grassroots conservatives in the 1950s. So the internationalist outlook among in the Republican Party always had to deal with the fact that there was also this still strong, somewhat subterranean opposition to international engagement. And I think Trump was, he was raised in that tradition. His father was active in the America First movement prior to the Second World War. So he echoes this isolationist nationalism.
Yeah, I'd like to bring someone from the online audience in here, and it might be a colleague of Michelle's, Michael Murphy from the Hank Center at Loyola in Chicago, who asked, the Republican National Convention takes place in Milwaukee next week. It is now patently clear that this will not be a Republican or conservative gathering, but a Trumpist coronation 2.0. What are some of the costs or losing the fruits of Buckley-esque losing some of the fruits of Buckley-esque conservatism, referring, of course, to William Buckley? Do you see any at all?
So this is a hard question. As someone who is not a conservative and never embraced William F. Buckley and intellectual conservatism myself, it's a really hard one for me to answer. But first of all, yes, there is a lot lost. There's a whole contingent of conservatives, from Liz Cheney to David Frum to Bill Kristol, people who were willing to conceptualize conservatism in a much more sophisticated way that wasn't just popular at the time, but was taken seriously as a tradition. They based it in history. They connected it to what they call the founding generation of the early American Republic. And so I do think that there are going to be costs to the MAGA movement if they let go of conservatism. I think conservatism has been a glue that has succeeded, especially because of its appeals to Christianity. It's really hard to see it's even hard to even describe what MAGA is. And I do think that is a major distinction and disadvantage to the movement. Manfred?
I don't think you have to be a conservative to see the enormous costs. Number one, I've always believed that the Bergian tradition of a healthy skepticism against utopianism has a very legitimate place in the history of political thought. And secondly, as many political scientists argue, we need a conservative party, a democratic conservative, small d, a democratic conservative party in every democratic system in order to represent people who share conservative values. And the problem with the GOP seems to me that it was once a respectable conservative party, whether you voted for it or not, and now has become a militant cult. And in a two-party system, that's a big problem.
Great. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I would like to draw attention again to identity politics. And the conservative says that Hispanics and African American immigrants have been driven to the Republican Party with the overuse of identity politics. And I see Phyllis Schlafly here, so I immediately start to wonder how this identity politics play a role within conservatism. Within the profound movement, you very much have women who are active as women. At the same time, we have a rhetoric of civil rights in sources as well, claim of reverse discrimination, all of these things. So yeah, I'm wondering whether identity politics play in within conservatism.
I have argued for a very long time that conservatism as a movement has always had its identity politics. So when critics are bringing attention to what they call identity politics, 90% of the time what they're talking about is racial identity politics or gender and sexual identity politics. But in the conservative movement, yes, you have voters who identify as parents, as mothers, taxpayers, Christians. What was that?
Gun owners.
Gun owners, yes. And so I feel like the right has been more successful in mobilizing against what Manfred called wokeism. The attacks against so-called critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion. What they're talking about is anti-racial politics, but they have successfully packaged it as a form of power, federal power or academic power by elites imposing these woke politics on people, when in reality, they're just, they're fighting something different.
I would argue that the polarization in the United States, and not just in the United States, but in Western societies at large, is at its core a conflict over identity. Who are we? And the challenge that we're facing, and that I think is a challenge that the US faces, but also Western Europe, is how do we define national identity in a multi-ethnic society without a dominant ethnic group? That's the challenge. And this is all about identity. The US can live and has always lived with vast economic inequality. Economic inequality, I think, becomes important because it's seen through the lens of identity conflicts.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to return again to our online followers here. And there's a question that comes back to your previous answer when you were talking about the GOP as more of a cult than a party, if I should put it provocatively. And here we have a question from an anonymous participant asking whether we could comment if there's a logical explanation for the cult-like following of the MAGA movement, and are there any historical parallels where we have seen this kind of blind loyalty to a movement? You're laughing,
yeah, I'm laughing because asking such a question in Germany invokes necessarily certain historical associations, which I would not reject out of hand, because what we're basically seeing is that movements need charismatic leaders, and they're not morally perfect. Quite to the contrary, many political psychologists argue that the extreme narcissism and manipulativeness of Donald Trump is part of what makes him so attractive. So there is a constituency for this, and perhaps has always been there. And I would, at this point in time, what I'm missing from the scene is that we have equally charismatic leaders who defend democracy. Someone like, don't want to become overly nostalgic, but someone like Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s. Democracy needs strong democratic leadership. And I guess we all agree that this is a very acute problem in the United States right now. Not only there, but it's particularly acute in the US.
Certainly. I think we had a few more questions. Yeah, here.
One area that has not been addressed today that I wanted to at least ask for some comment on, that is, this might be more of a regional, southern regional question, but I think it has a nationwide implication. And that is the mainline churches in small towns throughout the South are as influential in local politics and congressional races as the evangelicals. But in the South, going on right now with the Methodist Church in particular, is the Methodist Church is splitting in half over the issue of women pastors, LGBT pastors, and issues dealing with abortion, which in the Methodist Church were all a very conservative thing if you look at the participants. But the Methodist Church in the South, particularly in Alabama and Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, and Tennessee, has lost over half their churches, have left the mainstream Methodist Church and organized themselves into a separate congregation, or a separate denomination. I see this expanding nationwide over time, and the churches that are leaving are very, very conservative people, and they may in fact play some role in, for example, the Democrats not being able to majority. So any comments? Welcome.
Well, first of all, I'm interested in what you're saying about mainline churches, and I don't know that I agree with you about the kind of influence that they still have in local politics, maybe in certain parts of the South, but having lived myself in Dallas, Texas, I would say that's probably not the case. But I take your point about how these churches are splitting, and I think there are going to be political implications for that. But it reminds me of what happens in the Catholic Church, where conservatives stick things out and they take control of a tradition, and the dissidents, they tend to go on their own. But I don't think they necessarily disappear from politics. And I think that they probably very well influence the Democratic Party and other institutions, just not perhaps as a church, right? Meaning they've lost maybe a certain amount of institutional power that they once had, but they're still there.
Okay. Do we have nine? I think we had another question here from the audience, and then I will go back and for one or two last questions from the online audience, and then I think we should wrap it up. Right?
Thank you very much. You began describing conservatism in the United States, distinction from European conservatism, what is not difference are. I wonder when we get to normal traditions, conservatism, is there a commonality which we could describe conservatism globally, or at least in the West?
So the question, if I can try to put it very succinctly, is whether there is a common tradition of conservatism within the West, at least.
Well, conservatism arose in response to the French Revolution. That's at least the conventional wisdom. Famously, Berg's reflections on the French Revolution as one of the founding documents. And of course, the Bergian strand of thought skepticism toward utopian and radicalism, utopianism and radicalism, an appreciation for tradition and authority and for piecemeal change. I think that is what most conservatives had in common. But the national trajectories, of course, are then again very, very different. It is no coincidence that in Germany, West Germany after the Second World War, the Christian Democrats avoided the term conservatism like the plague because it had been tainted by its role. The conservatives, their role in the Weimar Republic wasn't exactly a glorious chapter in their history, and also their affiliation and corruption by the Nazis. Whereas in Britain, for example, I think that English Tory party is the only party that officially calls itself a conservative party. In that sense, I would argue, yes, there are certain ideological commonalities, but the national traditions are very important.
I would only add to that, historically speaking, that there have been points and times when that alignment has been much closer. I think of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and the Cold War. Also, you know, American conservatives coming out of the 50s really identified with this Western ideal of Edmund Burke and placing its roots in that tradition, you know, dating way back to the, you know, the anti-radicalism of the French Revolution era. But then also there was Friedrich Hayek writing in the London School of Economics, who equated the welfare state with authoritarianism. And so that also comes out. That's also, I would describe it as kind of a British and American connection that was important coming out of the post-war era.
Although Hayek and they were very uncomfortable with the term conservatism. They saw themselves as classical liberals.
They did, until in the United States.
Yeah, the term had been redefined.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, but I get your point. The conservative was a problematic word, right? In Europe, and perhaps that's why it's the, you know, the Americans and not the Europeans that embrace it with such force to replace the classical liberalism which they used to describe themselves for such a long time.
Okay, I have one question from the online audience, which has been on the list for some time, and I think we should talk about it. We should touch upon it a little bit, and that is about kind of the role of the media. And I wanted to maybe connect that to something I was that was going through my head also, and that is, I mean, if we look at these explanations for this type of conservatism here, or for conservatism in the US, the first wave, so to speak, of intellectuals, historians trying to grapple with, let's say, McCarthyism, which you could think of as some early incarnation of what we're seeing, was basically to treat it as a kind of pathology, right? Richard Hofstadter's paranoid style, status anxiety, and so on and so forth. So at least a semi-irrational aberration from a firmly established mainstream. So, and my sense is that there have been at least strong currents in our debates today, not in the debate here today, but in the larger reaction among the media, so to speak, also, that return to similar explanations, you know, not understanding how people could kind of join such a movement, you know, or be so. And the explanation mostly is, and now I kind of cut back media to kind of a catchword, is Twitter, you know, or X or social media in particular, which keeps people from accessing well thought out explanations for phenomena instead of tapping into something that is kind of absurd or kind of irrational. And so how do you see that kind of relationship? Is our reaction to this populism in the US today, is that a return to earlier explanations of conservatism in the 1950s plus Twitter, right?
We do risk this. It is, I find myself falling into that trap. It's hard not to when you have millions of Americans who refuse to accept the legitimacy of the last presidential election, who, you know, when we can't even agree that apples aren't oranges kind of thing, when 2 + 2 seems to amount to 7. I mean, it's really hard not to doubt the, it's hard not to doubt the judgment of these Trump voters and these people in the MAGA movement. And yes, Twitter is a problem, more so YouTube and other online venues where any information can be projected as truth. And we have to reckon with the way in which facts are handled, and this is legitimate. But at the same time, I do think there is a great deal of sophistication to this movement in terms of how strategists are organizing it, mobilizing money, mobilizing voters, and creating their own successful forms of media. I think that this is one of the ways in which they are finding victory in the current political landscape.
Yeah, I agree with Michelle that it is difficult to not to see the irrational, or to emphasize the irrationality. But of course we need, and this is the mistake that people such as Hofstadter and Schlesinger and others in their sort of liberal arrogance made, it led them to underestimate the strength and the dynamics behind the conservative movement. I mean, when they were writing about the liberal consensus and that everything was liberal in America and that conservatism was a fringe movement, you could already see at the grassroots level that the organizing was underway. So I think it is, regardless of what you believe, but we have to take these political forces very seriously. I don't have a solution how we can actually reach people who believe in all kinds of conspiracy theories. I find it appalling myself, and I feel at a loss in debating with such people. It may be my fault. And the other thing, of course, the internet works both ways. When Barack Obama utilized online formats, it was, we all talked about, you know, liquid democracy and how it would eventually enable us to have a true participatory style democracy. And 10 years later, everyone sees it like the polarization machine, as Juli called it. It certainly played the fragmentation of the public sphere. We use a Masian term here, certainly is part of the polarization landscape, not only in the US, but anywhere, everywhere else as well.
All right. So I think we started out with some comparative thoughts on European and American conservatism. And maybe we should end also on that note, which would allow me to bring kind of one more kind of online participant in, who asked also as a question for both of you, whether the Trumpist extreme right's embrace of Putin, and particularly Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, do you think, in light of that, whether it would be useful to see contemporary American conservatism as part of a larger constellation of autocratic far-right political parties and movements in Europe? And maybe in that same way, you know, how can we see, should we foresee a similar development in European conservatism as we have seen in the United States?
I would say
definitively,
yes, there is a relationship. And the quote that I did not read you earlier, I'm going to read you now. And this is from Steve Bannon. On our show, War Room, I probably spent at least 20% of our time talking about international elements in our movement. So we've made Nigel a rock star, Giorgia Meloni a rock star, Marine Le Pen is a rock star, Geert is a rock star. We talk about these people all the time. And so there is a concerted effort among activists and leaders and people with money in the American right, and you notice I'm not calling them conservatives, to form relationships with these right-wing leaders in Europe. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they're all finding themselves with more power than they did 10 years ago.
I think that I'm firmly convinced that the Make America Great Again movement is the American variant of the populist authoritarian revolt against liberal democracy, against liberal elites, and against globalization that has swept and transformed political culture in Western democracy profoundly. So obviously we have an ideological family resemblance here. I have to say that it's hard for me to imagine the United States being a centralized dictatorship because it's so diverse, so large. The tradition of federalism is so strong. But on the other hand, we should take these people, and we should take Donald Trump seriously. He has benefited immensely from the fact that people underestimated him and believed that he was somewhat of a clown who had a completely different agenda, wasn't really interested in politics. No, I don't think so. He talks like being a dictator, we should take it seriously. Someone who undertakes a putsch, a coup d'etat, in my humble view, and against the backdrop of German historical experience, has one place, and that is the federal prison and not the White House.
The one thing I would just add to that is I see your point about federalism. Maybe the United States is not constitutionally structured to go the way of National Socialism or the Soviet Union. But I do see a risk of kleptocracy, of oligarchy, of a new way of money and the American right asserting itself and taking away democracy and instituting a new illiberal order.
Okay. So with that, I'd like to thank, first of all, our two panelists here for fielding all these kind of questions from both here in Heidelberg and abroad. I think it was kind of the first time we did one of these hybrid formats. I think it worked, right? I want to thank also our co-conspirators, so to speak, in Washington at the German Historical Institute. Axel and Jansen and his staff, and would congratulate all those who dialed in and left kind of questions, both online as well as here in the audience. I think it was a very informative panel here, and we're of course planning to do it again on a different topic, probably in the early fall. So watch out on the websites of the German Historical Institute and also, of course, of the Heidelberg Center for American Studies. Thank you all for being with us tonight, and hopefully see you soon. Thank you.